And you can ask questions if you'd like. If you just want to chat it or put it in chat, that's fine. Okay. I'm sure she'll figure it out. So this is kind of a thing that I keep going back to, and I'll share this with you. And then the little Igong booklet is kind of where this fits in. But as you know, one of the reasons that I chose not to really go too deep into psychology is because, and there's certain things that like I'm just really surprised that I don't really hear this anywhere else. I don't think I've ever heard these sentences before. But Western medicine is a lot like Western psychology. They're very similar. They're looking for very simple one-to-one cause and effect. Your stomach hurts, take some medicine for your stomach. You're having this particular issue. Here is the diagnosis. And now we start to identify with that diagnosis. And then we take the medication that they give us. And that's a one-to-one type of thing. Psychology in the Western world is very similar, especially when it starts to deal with not necessarily abnormal psychology, but when people are having psychological difficulties, uh, it's one-to-one again. We want to change behavior. Let's look at the thought stream that is driving that behavior, and then let's prescribe some medication and let's chalk up a diagnosis. Does that sound familiar? So that the modern psychology is really similar to modern Western medicine, treating symptoms and also like really driving a diagnosis. I think the diagnosis needs to be driven for the person to accept the medication. Usually it's like, well, I don't want to take this shit. And the doctor's, well, no, you have yada, yada, yada. And then you're like, oh my God, I have yada, yada. And then they Google it and they're like, yes, sign me up for that medicine. But modern psychology is similar. So of course, one of the reasons that I'm a balanced person, so I can find the balance between Western and Eastern. I don't want to say philosophy because we're talking about medicine, but viewpoints on things. I can find the happy medium and join them together, and that's really the genesis, or well, it's the genesis of Igong and why I wanted to call it that, and you know why it is what it is and why it's so important. That's kind of what I wanted to just touch on real quick in the beginning because it was just Lauren and I, so I was just going to go into a little spiel. But I like traditional Chinese medicine. It's one of the many, different forms of natural. I'm not a huge fan of the word healing, but that's what they call it, natural healing modalities. But let's follow this line of reasoning. And this was given to me by Joshua Grant, who has been a licensed acupuncturist since the dinosaur age. So, traditional Chinese medicine, child misses their mother. This is his example, by the way. The child missing their mother leads to tummy ache. Well, yeah. I guess hold on. I'll put this. Forgot. So this is another way of looking at what we're always talking about. Displacing the flow of qi is what I call interference. I'll give a graham cracker, an animal cracker, to anybody who can tell me what the number one form of interference in the human experience is. That is displacing the flow of qi. I actually wrote it on the whiteboard, sort of. Anybody know? What is the number
Fear.
one thing? Yes.
Fear.
Beer?
Fear. Yeah.
Oh, fear.
I don't know. Something like that.
Yeah, no.
Discomfort.
Well, I think fear is an okay word, but fear by itself doesn't necessarily displace chi. Actually, it will. It will definitely depending on how you interact with the fear, your response to the fear. But the fear itself can be a natural thing. You know, we naturally have this fight or flight response, but it is, and the identification to thought does come in, but the way that we express our interaction with fear is typically through thought patterns. So it's the sheer volume of thought. And then, of course, identification is a result of the sheer volume, and then we start going down a long rabbit hole. And then, as Lauren put it, identification to thought is these thoughts, these words, these beliefs. That's who we are. And we start to just narrowly focus on just that one thing. And a lot of that, if not all of that, to Jerry's point, will be driven by fear. But I wouldn't put fear itself, because fear itself has a very natural element to it. Every animal has a sense of fear. Psychological fear is kind of something a little bit different that we create. Yeah. I'm going to blow my nose real quick. Give me 1 second. Sorry. Thought itself, again, thought itself is an amazing thing. It's our ability to communicate. It's the complexity of our human brain allowing us to put these concepts into a verbal type of thing that we can also do in our head. So thought itself, you know, it's okay. It's not the enemy, but what we do with it is the issue. And it's the number one cause of the interference. And I would say that maybe some of the source of that primary thing that we're doing, the underlying source, could very well be fear. That's definitely one of the enemies of knowledge that we talked about 2 weeks ago. Okay, BRB, I'm just going to get some tissue because coffee makes my nose run. Coffee and soup. Soup will do it too. What do you mean by attention, Donna? I'm not sure how that connected.
Well, the thing that disrupts chi is an imbalance. So whether there's no, we do have cognition, we can't get rid of cognition, but thought is the identification with, it's when it becomes an imbalance. So when your cognition and your sensory perception and your behavior get anywhere in the extreme, that's what causes the interruption of chi. So where you're placing your attention, if it's not in the moment happening now, then you're outside your current experience. So that's what I
Yep,
meant by attention.
that makes sense. I would say then if we get to the root source has to be a violation of principle. That's an easy way to find the root source of things, is you can trace it back to principle and which principles are being violated. So the number one principle that's violated that displaces chi and or we can just call it the energy body if the word chi doesn't vibe with you, the unseen aspect of the human being, because we know it exists. We just don't know everything there is to know about it. So I'll just leave it as the energy body. But you know, the principle that's being violated is the balance principle. So it's thinking too much is the number one thing that humans do that displace chi. But if we start to trace back the causes, yeah, the underlying root cause would be existing in an extreme or perpetuating an imbalance that will cause suffering. That's the principle. So displaces the flow of chi and then causes tummy ache. And then let's say that this child becomes an adult. I don't really think that that we, especially in the Western society, I don't think we really understand as a society how much extreme emotions take from our vital life essence, how much that affects our spirit every time we get angry. I think an analogy that was given to me one time is that the human being is a lot like a candle. We have wax, we have a wick, We have a little flame, and then we have light from that flame. The candle wax is what we're born with, but we can't replenish. We can't add to that. So that's kind of like our little sand timer. And a lot of the emotions and even some of the physical activities, but especially the emotional soup that we create, can drain our candle wax fast. And it doesn't really increase the brightness of our flame. It just is wasting our wax. Does that make sense? That's a loose analogy, if you will, but the candle analogy is a nice one. Long gave me that analogy. Now, the child has learned to interact with themselves this way. So they've continued this child misses their mother thing. They haven't really come to understand their emotions or interact with their emotions in an intelligent way, in a beneficial way. So the adult creating emotions creates long-term displacement. So a way that we could look at this is you're displacing the spirit. You're affecting the unseen aspect of the human being through the chemical and physical. So you're interacting with the unseen, just not directly. However, do Tai Chi, Qigong, you start to interact with the energy directly through intention, not through trying to control or using force. It is literally just intention itself. And I'll get to your question, Jerry. Let me just finish this chart real quick so we have a full thing to discuss. Creates long-term displacement. Placement. Then we'll get into dream walking. Maybe. Because I have too many topics before I start school, so I have to decide what I want to do. I might do a webinar or something because I can't continue Tuesdays. But creates long-term displacement, causes long-term illness. Okay, so in this dynamic, the child missed their mother, that displaced the chi, that caused a tummy ache. They continue as a child, they grow up and they continue to interact this way. They continue with overthinking, they continue with all of these other things that they do, and they continue to exist in an extreme, which continues to displace chi, and it leads to a long-term illness, which could even lead to death. Does that make sense? This is a real traditional way of looking at how we get sick. Now, if you look at traditional Chinese medicine, the neurological activity is also taking away from what they call defensive chi. So we're not able to fight off infections as much. We're not able to fight off, and you could say that defensive chi interacts with the immune system. All that aside, whether that's literal or, just a way of talking about things, the bottom line is that our psychology is, as Jerry put it, is projecting, or it is a derivative. It's like a domino effect, right? So the way that we're interacting with our mind also influences the way that we interact with our body. I guess I didn't do that in this chart, but a long-term displacement of chi, other habits will be created. So creates long-term displacement and habits that perpetuate the displacement, such as maybe they don't sit as well. They've accumulated social habits. And then before you know it, we start to get into limited beliefs and we start to tell each other, this is the human experience. This is the way it's supposed to be. We're supposed to do this. This is the cycle for every living human being since the dawn of time. But there is absolutely no principle under the sun that dictates that. So we're really just making shit up. That's the definition of a limited belief. All that. So Donna, what doesn't make sense about that? You said sort of.
I don't really like the child example. I mean, on a basic, as
It's
as
very basic.
illustration, I like it. It's okay. But you know, a baby is born with gross ways of perceiving the world, and they become finer tuned as they grow up. And so, a child to me is, like a baby doesn't know the pain because the safety pin stuck him or he's hungry. It's all pain. Pain is one big giant thing, and it starts to differentiate as they grow and mature, as their brain matures. So a child having a tummy ache from missing their mother, I don't think it's the uh, I don't know. I think it is a normal a normal reaction for them to have a tummy ache.
Maybe,
It's
yeah,
yeah,
yeah, we
yeah. So I guess the response from the parent, I don't know. The parent's job is to soothe the child and give them
soothe
what
the
it needs,
child,
and
yeah.
it's the child's job to cry when it needs it because it
Yeah,
doesn't have a sophisticated form of communication or even perceiving what they're feeling. So
true.
it's not the best example. I mean,
Well,
I see what Long is saying. I
that
saw
was
it in
Joshua
school all
Grant.
the time, Joshua Grant.
Yeah.
Um, you know, people have aspirin and Tums and Mylanta, and they have a million medicines in their house. And a child, as they grow older, watches their parents treat things. And so it's hard to determine whether allergies are common in a family
Yeah.
genetically and headaches are genetic and stomach aches are genetic, or it's just something they learned, like you're saying in your illustration right here.
Yeah, so this is basically a very basic, and it is basic. That's what Joshua was hoping to achieve, is just a very, so he could talk to people that aren't privy to these types of things. You know, he's not talking to a doctor when he gives this example, but it is a very good example of how the psychology is what caused the tummy ache. That's what a lot of people can't associate. For example, we know scientifically, and I don't normally speak that way, but we know scientifically that a lot of our sickness is directly related to stress, and that inflammation is a stress response. And we know that the stress is directly related to the psychology, but yet we don't talk about it, we don't address it, we don't go there. And the reason I like this example is because if we teach the child how to interact with their emotions, how to understand and observe and adapt and learn and grow from their emotions, then they can break this dynamic completely. And then it
I
will be a
understand
very natural
completely,
thing.
but it doesn't really happen with a little child. They actually do get a stomach ache
Well, I
if they
didn't
miss
give an
their mother.
age. This could have been a
Yeah.
12-year-old child, a 10-year-old
Oh,
child.
okay.
And another example could be Ernest, displaced his chi when he cleaned the apartment, right? So the psychology is I wanted to clean the apartment, but that's not really an extreme, so it doesn't lead to long-term suffering. It just led to short-term, as in this example. So, but of the details aside, it definitely illustrates that the psychology displaces the chi, leads to the condition, and in Western medicine, they would just treat the tummy ache. You would soothe the tummy, right? You would do something directly for the tummy. And that's how we begin interacting with our illnesses and the things that don't feel good. And then that can create this adult condition where the adult continues to interact with their emotions in a non-beneficial way that creates long-term displacement of the energy body, spirit, whatever you want to call it. And that also lends to other habits, the four destroyers or five destroyers, depending. And then that causes long-term illness. Now, acupuncture, moxibustion, all of these different things that they have created in traditional Chinese medicine usually begins about right here because it depends. In uh, a more traditional sense, it begins much earlier because you want to see the doctor before you get sick. They help prevent illness. But this is typically where I'll say like TCM comes in. And then, we'll get acupuncture to help treat the long-term illness. And really what acupuncture is treating is the chi, is the energy body. And that's all fine and great, but it never really gets to the root. And I talked to this yesterday with another acupuncturist, and I'm like, okay, so somebody comes in with stress, or they're having the stress response. They're not even making the connection. So they're having all of this inflammation in their body. They have heart disease, liver disease, and they won't change their lifestyle. So they're hurting their body. They're doing all of these things. But the driving cause of the tension is the stress, and the driving cause of the stress is their psychology. What are we doing to address the psychology? And then drumroll, please, that is what Qigong is for. So Qigong will address the psychology and help to correct the underlying imbalance. Modern psychology doesn't do that. It's not looking to get to underlining, because it's not even talking about balance principle or any of that stuff. It's just looking at things in a very rudimentary kind of way. And it's just there's very little I could do with that. We need to get to the source of the psychology, which is the overall volume, not just what we're thinking. And now this will really throw psychologists for a loop because they're probably doing it too. Thinking all the time is a gross imbalance in itself that is a form of interference. Does that make sense? So, the little child aspect aside, that is really just to kind of show how one thing leads to another. And then over time, it leads to the world that we're living in with all of these weird illnesses and diseases. And I grew up believing that this was just a crapshoot, that there's nothing that I can do, right? I just live my life and 50-50 chance I get cancer, 50-50 chance I get, leukemia, who knows? So just fuck it, just do whatever you want to do because you have no idea. It's all a crapshoot anyway. False. Now there are some random variables. So that's a part of it, but it's just a small part of it. It's not the whole scope. So Qigong is something that I created to add to traditional Chinese medicine, which is why I called it Qigong. And I know that there's a lot of traditionalists who will be like, how dare you? I don't care. I've added Qigong to the traditional Chinese medicine scope so that we can do the acupuncture, do the moxibustion, do the, different cupping and, the physical techniques and things like that to help correct the energy flow. But then let's talk about the mind so that the energy can continue to flow smoothly and we can really get better treatment outcomes. So what we're doing is we're getting to the very root of all of our physical suffering by addressing the psychology. Does that make sense? And we're doing it through the lens of Qigong, interference, the balance principle, and things like that. So that is the reason that I call it Qigong. That's the reason that I'm organizing it the way that I'm organizing it. And I'm sure that if you have a little foresight, you can imagine me doing acupuncture, doing Qigong with people, and then saying, hey, totally optional. But if we really want to address the root of all of the inflammation that you're creating, we have to talk about the mind. And it's not psychology or anything like that. It is attention based. So that's kind of where everything fits in. Does that make sense? And I was just kind of explaining that to Lauren just to kick things off because it was just her and I in the beginning. But Jerry, did you have a question? I can answer it if there's a question.
Just when you started your drawing, I just didn't know what TCM was. I don't recall that.
My bad. Traditional Chinese medicine. Yeah.
Oh, thanks.
And there's other ways of looking at medicine. It's not really medicine, but it's looking at health and the body. Ayurvedic ways. There are, what's that? It's a word that's gaining popularity, but it just means natural. You're looking for more natural remedies.
Holistic.
Holistic is a word that we could use, but that's not the word.
Homeopathic.
Homeopathic, yes, homeopathic. So, there's other ways of looking at things. And I've always said that that's why we called it in the beginning approach, because it's not the way, right? There could be other ways to direct attention, to gather the elements of the mind and direct it intentionally. So I'm not going to say this is the only way, but I think that this is a very thorough, very well organized way, which eventually leads to a topic. I might combine topics today. It's 6:37. The next two topics were dream walking and then the difference between shifting and modulating the lens of perception. I think one thing that we need to talk about, or that we could talk about, is the last maybe 7 or 8 topics in the 20 topics is what I would call non-ordinary cognition. And the reason I'm classifying it this way is because it fits. It makes a lot of sense, but it also helps me to establish more balance. For example, let me just tell you what ordinary and non-ordinary cognition is. So the easiest way to define it, and it doesn't create separation from people, Lisa, ordinary psychology, so we don't want to start creating, that type of thing. Right? That's not what we're looking for. We're not looking to create.
You mean hierarchy, us and them,
Yeah,
superiority
definitely
levels,
not looking for that. Yeah, that's a bunch of junk. I don't care about any of that. What I am looking at is a way to create the differentiation between opposites so that I can find the balance between the two. Really difficult to find balance between two things if you can only identify half of the equation. So ordinary and non-ordinary cognition. I'll write this on the board because I'm actually, well, no, I'm not going to tell you that. That's a secret. Okay, so ordinary and not, I'm going to save this whiteboard if there's no questions, because this was pretty, not really review.
Are you doing the intro to the topic
What's
now?
that? Yes, I am. Yeah, I'm starting to get
Okay.
into the topic now. Yeah. I guess that kind of was an intro to the intro, but so I'm starting by classifying what we're talking about here as ordinary or non-ordinary cognition. And the reason it's important to understand that we're doing ordinary or non-ordinary is to find balance, and then also to balance that throughout the day so that we can be interacting with both ordinary and non-ordinary cognition simultaneously. So it's not rejection of one and clinging to the other. But as you can imagine, the human being on average is just interacting with ordinary cognition. There's almost no non-ordinary. I will say, though, that the more that I explain this, the more that you'll make a connection to it, because everything that we love to experience is usually in the form of non-ordinary cognition. So art, for example, when we really feel that creative energy flowing and we're just creating our masterpiece, we are in a flow of non-ordinary cognition. Now, what does that mean? So ordinary cognition and non-ordinary. So we'll kind of classify this. I don't know why it does that. Let's just put the glaring obvious one in ordinary. Thought. All thought. I don't care what it's about. You could be thinking about thinking about not thinking about what it means to be thinking about how we're thinking about positive thinking about ourselves leveling up to the next interdimensional yada yada. That is all still just thought, and it is a form of ordinary cognition. So we'll just put that one out there. That's easy. But the best way to classify this is ordinary is going to be more physical. And I do have kind of a third. And in non-ordinary, it will be more non-physical. And we're talking about stuff in a very relative way. Obviously, physical, non-physical, what is that? Philosophically, there's no such thing. But we're talking about this in, I spelled physical wrong. That's okay. Spelled it correct here. So if you're talking about your car, you're talking about ordinary cognition. If you're talking about your job, you're talking about ordinary cognition. If you're talking about what you hope to achieve in the next 20 years, you're talking about ordinary cognition. If you're talking about what the other person did to the other person at the party last, ordinary cognition. All of that is just ordinary cognition.
Cleaning the apartment.
Ordinary cognition. Yeah. And that's okay. Again, we're not declaring war on ordinary cognition. We want to find a balance between ordinary and non-ordinary. So I do classify an in-between physical and non-physical, like air. Air is something that seems, I can see it sometimes, but I can also not see it. So it's in this interesting limbo between physical and non-physical. The energy body, non-physical. So if you were doing a meditation or doing a practice that interacted with your energy body, you are in a form of non-ordinary psychology. Because the energy body can't really be seen. Does that make sense? This is a classification. The reason that I form these classifications in organization is to find balance. That's it. I'm not trying to further describe the indescribable. There would be no point in that. Does this make sense so far between ordinary and non-ordinary cognition? Another way to look at this is typical versus non-typical. That's another way that we could look at ordinary versus non-ordinary. So if you're worried about what somebody else is thinking, that is a form of typical cognition. And typical will change over time, right? Depending on, and typical could be different depending on the area. So there's some wiggle room with this. But in general, typical will be typical. It'll be what people are commonly thinking about. They're thinking about their goals, their desires, their hopes, their aspirations, and it's usually all very physical, right? So a non-physical goal What is that? Well, if we don't even know, then we probably don't have any. And that's something that we'll talk about more later is that's actually in one of the principles towards the end in hydrostasy, the abstract principles. So I'll get into that. Peace, there you go. So peace is a good example of something that we could look at as to be non-physical. Peace is a mind that's not at war with itself. You can still observe it, you can still feel it, but it is a little bit difficult to, it depends on the goal by itself maybe, but what is the goal around? If the goal is around a car, if the goal is around getting a job, I would say that that's ordinary cognition. Feeling to a certain extent, sure. Yeah, so we're starting to get into some of these, some of the ones that you've named are kind of in that quasi in between, right? Oh, peace is a goal. Sure. Yeah. I would say peace is a goal, inner peace, the feeling of peace. Another way to look at it is visible to the other person or invisible. That's abstract. So is it abstract or is it literal? So I think that a person having a goal towards peace is a little bit more abstract. Another person may not see it. They may see the derivative of that, like me not getting angry about the dog pooping all over the house. Somebody would see that. They'd be like, Ernest, you did that with such patience. I wish there was somebody to see it because I did. That would be an example of non-ordinary cognition. Does that make sense? Jerry, yes, you have a question. I also have to sneeze, just a heads up.
This class would fall into non-ordinary.
Sometimes what we talk about is ordinary. Sometimes what we talk about is non-ordinary. The class itself is quite ordinary because I'm using words. We're using a very ordinary form of cognition to communicate. A non-ordinary form of way of communication, we would have to go out into the forest and meditate, you do all kinds of different things to, I don't even know. I can't even
Yeah,
imagine.
I'm talking about this class. What
The
we're
co-
discussing here is not ordinary. I don't think I wouldn't put it as ordinary discussion.
what
It's
we're
very,
discussing may not
it's
be
this class.
ordinary. The act of discussion is. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay,
But I mean, just the topics, what we've been doing here
typically
doesn't feel
correct.
ordinary to me. I think it's very
Yeah.
groundbreaking.
I would say so. Yeah.
Cutting edge, that term you use.
Hmm. I would say so. Yeah, I would say a lot of our topics would be considered non-ordinary.
But we're using ordinary cognition to discuss it.
100%. Yep.
It's all we got. It's all we got.
I'm not sure it's all we got. I think that that is what we rely on. I actually think that the human being can access many more avenues of communication other than just verbal and thought-based.
I think
I
if we
get that.
all
I
met in
get that. But
person,
coming into this class with you just sitting here
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
and us all looking at each other, come on.
It's what we have it available, so we're using it. We could just say it that way. What were you saying, Donna? Yeah.
I was going to say something and then Jerry's interjection made me expand that thought, actually. Um, yes, the fact that I was going to say if we all met, I was originally going to say if we all met together and went for a walk in the woods and didn't speak, there would be a level of communication and experience going on with the group that was probably a lot of non-ordinary um, experience, communication in it,
Mhm.
without words.
Yes.
And then we would discuss it afterwards using
Yes.
ordinary cognition to
Okay.
discuss it, but we would be discussing the abstract. But she's right. I agree with her. I don't want to say she's right because there's no right and wrong.
I know what you mean.
I agree with her in that meeting here together, doing that is a very similar experience because I know I could reread my notes and, I can have an interaction with my life experience. It's very different from, it's not very different, but it is different from this gathering because we choose to gather it in and of itself. It's a kind of formal practice that has a meditative quality to it. My consciousness, um, I have an intention about it, and everybody coming to the class has an intention about it. You have an intention about it, and there is an unseen power, an unseen effect in that. And so it does fall in the non-ordinary category.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I'm good with that. And remember, we're categorizing things to work with them, not to create like any final judgment about anything, right? It's just, this is just a good way to organize things so I can see what I'm doing. And so I can
And it's a good
evaluate it
way to
simply.
discuss what we've been experiencing by practicing. Yeah.
Yes. And I think it's a good segue to discuss what's coming next because it's all non-ordinary. It is to a person who's not practicing, this looks like a bunch of mumbo jumbo. It looks to some people maybe even impossible to hold multiple points of attention all throughout the day. What is he even talking about? Like, I can't even remember my damn tricks of attention, and he's talking about maintaining multiple points of attention simultaneously all day long. Like, what are we even talking about? So I just want to interject that we're starting to get into things that are very non-ordinary. So to some people, it will seem impossible. To some people, it will seem improbable. It just depends. But
Yeah, and the goal isn't to hold multiple points of attention. The goal is to operate from the feeling that has been created by doing that, by reducing the overall amount of thought. So the goal isn't if I can do 20 points of attention, then I've achieved something in this practice. It's the feeling like when you're talking about even the example by Joshua Grant, I notice that I operate much more from a feeling perspective. If something outside of me has elicited a reaction, it's probably because I am, and the degree of the reaction has to do with how many points of attention I'm holding and how much I'm embodying the practice or not. And so if my heart is racing or my breath becomes faster, I think, gee, I'm having a response to something that is out of balance for what occurred. So it must be my thoughts about it. Therefore, I'm not practicing. Hey, where's my feet? Where's my breath? Where's the color green? Whatever. So I operate from a feeling place. I operate from the non-ordinary a lot more often than I was before. And I probably couldn't understand that if you explained it to me before I started practicing. So the points of attention really isn't the goal. The points of it, holding the points of attention just expand the space that I want to engage.
yeah,
And that's and the feeling associated with that, the peace in it, the presence in my moments of my life, that's the goal.
yeah. One thing that I'm careful of is never making the feeling itself a goal, just because I could actually start to, and this is kind of a side thing. I don't want to go too deep into this, but we can actually start to cling and attach to certain emotional outputs, certain feelings. And so there's nothing wrong with an emotion, but if I start to make certain things a goal, then that can actually start to create an emotional imbalance.
Is
And
peace an
yeah,
emotion? I don't consider it an
no,
emotion.
peace is a mind that's not at war with itself.
Right,
So I
right.
think peace is a good one. I think that
Yep.
could be a good goal. Yeah, that's a
Yep.
good correction there. Yeah. So non-ordinary cognition is important because what we're talking about now is the very definition of non-ordinary. I look in a city of 3 million people, and there is absolutely nobody doing that I can believe doing anything remotely close to what I'm doing with my mind throughout the day. Because what Donna just explained is the mindfulness slider. It's not necessarily a goal to hold multiple points of attention or to hold points of attention. That's the mechanism, that's the technique, that's the bridge that crosses the divide between theory and application. But that's the mindfulness slider. If I'm holding 4 points of attention, I am not capable of thinking all of those thought streams. It doesn't work that way. The brain isn't wired that way. So if I have 4 points of attention, I'm doing so much in my present moment that thought just doesn't, and the patterns and the habits, they just don't have the energy they need to be sustained over time. So no, I wouldn't say that the technique or holding techniques, I don't want a person to create an obstacle or create goals out of that and we start timing it and all that bullshit. But ultimately, those techniques, holding points of attention, holding multiple points of attention, is what creates that first gate of seeing. And we talked about that before. And it's one of the most important techniques that I can possibly talk about. And it's engaging the space, the cognitive space, the piece that you're creating. Engaging that is the first gate, the most important gate, and it is the thing that we have to pass through before anything else in hydrostasy. We can really talk about it, such as deliberate modulation, sensing energy, and the act of alignment. They all follow that first technique, because the first three layers of the practice create the space. And then in hydrostasy, we really start to engage that space. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And when I say space, I mean the gaps in thought. It means that your mind isn't thinking right now, and you embrace that. You can feel it in your brain. I got that from a technique that I call mind gazing. I'm like, I can fucking feel this. Like, I can sense and perceive this feeling of maybe not relaxation, but non-tension, whatever the hell we want to call that. Does that make sense? Any questions so far about what we're discussing? That's actually an important segue, and I would have mentioned it anyway, is engage the space. That's a technique that we talked about earlier. Absolutely 100% required for anything that I don't know any other avenue.
For me, it's really important to review because engage the space meant I had it
I
defined
remember. Yeah, you
differently
were
in my
talking about,
brain,
yeah.
and I have to remind myself what it is,
Mhm.
because it's not what it sounds like to be in ordinary cognition.
Oh gosh, I've never heard this before. I've never heard anybody say to engage the space and the thoughts that
Sure,
you
it's to
created.
me,
Nobody's ever told
to
me
me,
that.
it was just another way of saying be present, engage the space, meaning the space that I'm sitting in, like engage the space with points of attention. That's not what you mean.
That's not what I mean. I mean, I want you to do, that's a great suggestion, do that, but that's not what I'm
Right.
talking about.
It
Yeah.
has nothing to do with the bubble of perception. It's the space that's created as a result
Yes,
of the techniques.
exactly.
That line with the spaces in it, just, I don't know, one day it was like, oh, engage the space. That's what he's talking
So the whole
about.
time I was messaging you and telling you that this is a hydrostasy, engage the space, you were doing it wrong.
I know, I
I
was
had to
just
explain it.
thinking of bubble of perception, more
Yeah.
points of attention. And I
No,
was
so
like, it didn't really follow what I was asking. Maybe I wasn't asking the question properly or something.
mhm,
No, I just wasn't understanding what you were saying.
yeah. And
So I think it is important to review now
yeah,
and then.
yeah, that makes sense. So the first three layers of the practice create the space. And in hydrostasy, we're able to maintain a point of attention. So we make that one of our cognitive directions. Remember, I have 4 directions of attention. The cognition direction of attention can be engaging that space and is a cornerstone of the hydrostasy practice. That's how you know if you should or should not be doing the hydrostasy practice or even trying it when I have it laid out in books. If you have no space to engage, you can't do hydrostasy, period. It's not accessible. That's okay. You just do the other 3 layers of the practice until you've created some space, engage it, and then you can start to move forward in hydrostasy. And then the more you move forward in hydrostasy, it is the very definition of non-ordinary cognition. So to put it in a balanced perspective, if I gave, I'm going to use Michael for my example for this one. If I gave Michael 3 hits of LSD, let's get crazy. We're going to give him about 500, I think it's micrometers, of LSD. That's a lot. He is going to be in a different state of mind. Would you think that he is in ordinary or non-ordinary cognition on 5 hits of acid?
If he's conscious, not non-ordinary.
If he's he'd probably still be conscious. I don't think I've ever seen anybody black
Definitely
out.
non.
Definitely non-ordinary. But could you also see how there's no balance there? Let's say Michael has a test to take, or Michael has an important business meeting and he just took 5 hits of acid.
He has to drive.
I don't recommend it. I did it once, and the road was like 2 inches. I was terrified. Even worse, I was picking up Kobe when he was like 2 or 3 years old. So yeah, I can smile about it now, but don't try this at home. Okay, so that's an example of you're so far into non-ordinary cognition that it's almost impossible for you to interact with the world. So it's not all that beneficial because it's existing in an extreme. So even in non-ordinary cognition, we still want to be able to interact with our environment because that has to do with our biological safety. So our brain typically will become, unless you've learned how to do this, 5 hits of acid will terrify the mind because it's losing its touch with physical. Does that make sense?
Yeah, there's no balance,
There's
no
no balance.
comparison, there's no black and white, it's all fluid.
You
And
are,
there's,
yeah, yeah. And that was just acid. If we had done ayahuasca, DMT, or something like that, you can forget it. You're so far into non-ordinary cognition that interacting with the world would be impossible in any beneficial way, any intentional way. Crawling into the bed, drooling, that's not that we wouldn't say that that's very productive. That's not the best way. So on the other hand, folks who are almost never in non-ordinary cognition, they're in an opposite extreme, and that's the world we live in. Some people want to go from one extreme to the other. They're like, we should just level up and be in non-ordinary, leveled up cognition. And I'm like, okay, cool. What are you going to do? What are you going to do when you level up and you get to the fifth dimensional level of yada yada? You're attached to pizza. Is there going to be pizza there when you get there? You're attached to, derivatives from other people. Where do all your attachments go when you instantly level up, or do you take those with you? It's because we're just making shit up. But non-ordinary versus ordinary cognition is the segue to dream walking, because dream walking is 100% unequivocally the balance between ordinary and non-ordinary cognition. It is, I don't know about the perfect it is very comfortable, very cozy balance between ordinary and non-ordinary cognition. So what does that
what
mean?
are you saying? What are you saying is the balance?
Dream walking,
Dream
which
walking.
is,
Okay.
which is the topic for today. Yeah. Dream walking is, and if I started to kind of mix next week's topic, and I guess one of the reasons I made it its own topic is, again, to differentiate the difference between a modulation and a shift. So let's say that Donna is in ordinary cognition and she's just doing her thing. And then all of a sudden, she looks at the dishes and the apple basket and she's like, I'm so inspired. She just had a modulation, right? She was in ordinary cognition and she modulated a little bit. Does that make sense? Because she saw a little bit of the artist's edge, a little bit of the abstract quality of the moment. So she had a brush with that. Does that make sense? That's a shift. Or excuse me, it's a little modulation. I want to use my own words correctly. So she modulated accidentally. In hydrostasy, we modulate intentionally, which is fun. Does that make sense, Donna?
It makes sense if you, I think we've all had, even before this practice, brushes with.
Oh yeah,
That's
some
why
of it.
that's why I got hooked on things like whatever, whatever substances or yoga class or whatever. I was like, if I had brushes with it during that, because I was temporarily suspending the overall volume of thought by focusing my attention on it, it gave me some space to engage. And so, but I made a window, a snapshot of that, thinking that this yoga class is what I need for the space. So therefore, I use deductive reasoning. If I just do more yoga or more meditation or smoke more pot or whatever, I will be in that space more often, and that's what I desire. And then I would level up because I would have more time or money or energy or strength to do this more often. But yeah, it was brushes with it.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't understand the dynamics at play in order to be able to recreate it. So I thought
Right.
I would have to go do that. like this class, like I have to be in this class, otherwise my practice falls apart. It's not the class that gives me the practice, it's the practice that gives me the practice.
That makes sense. And I'm going to refill my coffee and then I'll be right back. Give me just a minute and then we'll go even further into this discussion. And I'll just go ahead and mix the difference between the shift and a mod.
We need coffee refill like music, or I don't know, singing bowls, or somebody singing a song. We need a time filler for coffee refills.
It's one love, one heart said, let's get together and feel alright. Hear the
Thank
children crying.
And this
Hear the
intervention was
children
brought to you by
crying.
Michael.
you. Thanks, Mike.
Praise to the Lord, and I will feel.
All right, so moving on. I'm going to continue to use Michael as my example. So Michael has taken 5 hits of acid. Has he had a shift or a little modulation? Do you think?
I'm feeling good.
Maybe.
I think he's had a big modulation. It's just not necessarily deliberate.
It's not deliberate at all.
Right.
You're right. Yeah, but it is. I would consider it a shift. His entire bubble of perception has shifted, and Michael says he's feeling good. I don't know if he's ever taken 5 hits of acid, because what is occurring is your assemblage, the picture that you're creating is wrong. Now I don't want to say wrong. It's just, it's getting mixed up. You look at a color and you feel it in your soul. You feel the color. You taste the sound. It's like, how is this happening? So
But none of it is intentional, which is why it can be terrifying.
none of it is intentional, because it's a substance that's doing the work. It's which is why it can be terrifying. It can also be a nice way to, and indigenous cultures would use it to shift and modulate the lens of perception, just to show you that it can be done, just to show you that the world of physical matter is not all there is.
And I think they operated on a daily basis in the non-ordinary and the ordinary. There was more balance in their
I would assume, yeah.
less overall volume of thought. So their interaction with substances could be more medicinal, more deliberate,
Sure.
and less frightening, because they existed in a place where that was not completely unfamiliar to them. It was just a deeper dive into it.
Yeah. With that said, there were many indigenous who were addicted to tobacco because they got addicted to tobacco. So there were still some in the cultures who didn't know when to say when, and then of course they would get into addictions and habits just like anyone else. So
Right. I had a brush with something and I want more of it, so let
yeah.
me do more of it.
Get my buttons mixed up there. Okay, so now dream walking is a result of the practice. So when I talk about results of the practice, it's not something that you can just invoke. You can't just, I'm going to turn dream walking on. It doesn't work that way. Dream walking is the longer term. I don't want to say long term, but it requires the energy of momentum. It's a principle that we work with, accumulative momentum. I can't violate that principle and I can't change it. When engaging the space and the overall gaps in thought are allowed to accumulate momentum, and there's a lot of technique involved in everything that we're doing, throughout, but there comes a time when we're so far into a shift of the lens of perception that I get an image in my mind of, like, have you ever seen a before and after picture where a little line kind of goes down the picture and then it's just suddenly different? That's kind of how the world seems to a certain extent. Give me 1 second. But dream walking is, I call it that for a reason, because if you are lucid in your dream, you no longer have the same emotional derivative. You don't have the same emotional response as when you're non-lucid. When you're dreaming and you're not lucid, your nervous system doesn't know the difference. So if there's something frightening, you get really scared and you go through all the same physiological conditions, similar, maybe not all, but most of the same physiological conditions that you would experience if you were awake and seeing the same thing to a certain extent. Does that make sense? In a non-lucid dream, your nervous system doesn't know the difference. So it feels like
Feels real. Yeah.
feels real. In a lucid dream, you know that you're dreaming, and so the monster doesn't scare you. Does that make sense? You look at the monster, you know you're dreaming, you know it's a machination of your mind. Does that make sense?
It does. I've had an in-between place though,
Sure.
where I know that I'm dreaming, but I've yelled out and I made a noise, or my heart is racing. My body is having the symptoms of being frightened, but I recognize that I'm just being frightened by a dream that's not real. So it's kind of like an in-between state. I'm recognizing
Yeah.
what's happening, but I haven't necessarily eliminated. I'm not in non-fear. I recognize that my body is reacting fearfully to something that's a dream.
Yeah, I would say that's a subject to the accumulative effect as well. The more that you get familiar with lucid dreaming, the less that you'll have the response. And much like in uh, ordinary cognition or waking cognition, you see yourself starting to go into an emotion and then you redirect. You can do the same thing in a dream. So literally, you can do this practice while you're dreaming.
Yes, that's what's happening.
Yeah. Okay, so the idea, though, is that I noticed that I had a similar feeling in my waking experience, like I was dreaming. Meaning that, like, I know that I'm not in a dream, but because I'm not in that old ordinary cognition of thinking about my problems and trying to control and everything is about me and desires and all of that bullshit, then just like in the dream, I'm just lucidly walking through my waking experience. And that creates what I call the hydrostasy effect. The hydrostasy effect can be defined by these two things. You know if it's occurring by these two things. You are not bored or otherwise at odds with the present moment. So if you feel bored and you need to watch TV, you are most certainly not dream walking. If you're like, oh my God, I need to get this done, it's very, very important, gotta go, gotta go, gotta go. Depending on, I guess you could do that in dream walking and still get shit done, but you wouldn't have the cognition or the anxious energy, is what I'm saying. Does that make sense? So you're going through dream walking is going through your waking life as if you were lucid dreaming. Because also through technique, you're starting to see more of the universal perspective. We're all one, man. How about do that as a technique? How about feel that oneness in the moment rather than just talking shit about it? See what I mean? And then that will start to accumulate, engaging the space will, and along with other techniques that I'll offer in hydrostasy, we end up with this effect that we call, or that I call, dream walking. Dream walking is going through your waking state as if you were lucid dreaming. And yes, you are more calm, you are more relaxed, things don't bother you as much. It's not all doom and gloom. The human mind has an incredible capacity to overemphasize small shit and make it into the biggest thing in the whole world. I watched this video of a kid who their parents canceled their World of Warcraft account or some shit like that. And this kid just flipped shit, like just severe psychological over World of, and someone else would look at that and be like, it's just World of Warcraft. There's fucking wars going on in the world. That's why we can't compare suffering, because the mind has the capacity to create severe psychological suffering out of some of the most simplistic things. So most people are doing the opposite of dream walking. They're walking around in ordinary cognition, thinking about their problems, thinking about their goals, thinking about their hopes, thinking about their wants, thinking about their desires. I, me. It's not wrong to have self-care. It's not wrong to have a desire. I don't look at these things as wrong at all. What is a violation of principle is sitting there and thinking about that shit all the time. Why are you thinking about yourself all the time? And that's the bottom line. Does that make sense? And I would say that dream walking is that perfect blend. It's you're doing your physical, because in dream walking you're still getting stuff done. You're still able to interact. I'm still dream walking. I'm still in that. No, I wasn't dream walking when Neo was shitting on the floor. I backed it up a little bit there. But walking to work the other day, yesterday actually, I go outside, it's 65 degrees and I'm doing my practice. I have shifted my lens of perception. Have you ever seen Shawshank Redemption? Has anybody seen that? You know, when Andy Dufresne is walking through the prison courtyard as if he's walking through the park without a care in the world? That's dream walking, except for he was doing something sneaky. He was creating a hole in the wall and just slowly putting the dust and rocks out through his pockets, which I thought was
He
fucking.
was maintaining points of focused attention,
Oh yeah,
so,
he was. Yeah. But just using that example from a fictional movie, that's what dream walking would feel like. When I'm walking through a city and everybody's hustling and bustling, they've acclimated to the unconscious pace of the city, and everybody thinks they're so cool, and we have our headphones in, and we have our designer clothes, and our perfect thighs are show. That's all fine, and it is all very likely heavily steeped in ordinary cognition. Uh, Mating rituals is ordinary cognition. The desire to have sex is a form of ordinary cognition. How you interact with that act can be very non-ordinary, just depends on the two people or three people or whatever you're into. Does that make sense? Is this starting to come together at all? Imagine your life experience without the baggage. What would that feel like? It would feel eventually like what I call dream walking.
Peace.
Peace is the predecessor, and peace is there throughout. If you don't feel peace, you can't be dream walking. It's impossible, because engaging the space is the predecessor technique, the first gate of seeing. And then seeing is when we have a broader perspective, because what do you think happens when you're not steeped in all your own bullshit? It's like that little line that goes across the screen of the TV and you see the before and the after picture. All of a sudden life becomes high definition, infinite detail. And you know what? I'll always be doing something, but I don't need to make everything into a big deal. I don't have to make everything into doom and gloom. I'll be 110 years old and I won't give a shit about signing up for too many classes on Monday. That's something that I'm navigating right now. Somehow I got signed up for a class that is in person on Monday, and it's kind of messing with my schedule. I'll figure it out, or I won't. But I'm not going to make a big deal out of it out of the moment. What does that serve? How does that benefit me? So I'm just going to keep dream walking through my day. Does that make sense? And dream walking is a shift. You have deliberately, intentionally, and willfully shifted your lens of perception, not just a little modulation. You're still continuing to modulate within the larger shift. But if you can shift your lens of perception, the whole world changes. Everything changes. It's almost a total change. Still within balance and everything else. You're not losing touch with anything. That would be existing in an opposite extreme. So we don't want to lose touch either. We want to maintain that balance as we interact with the world around us. And this non-ordinary form of cognition is something that will start to occur all throughout the hydrostasy practice. And we shouldn't even be touching the hydrostasy practice until we've adequately done warrior training. Because if you're still thinking about yourself all the time, everything that I'm talking about will be inaccessible. You can't do both. You can't sit there and think about yourself and simultaneously enjoy the effects of the space that you've created, because you haven't created any space because you're sitting there thinking about yourself. And if you're not doing the practice, you can forget everything I'm talking about. You might have a brush with it someday, very haphazardly or whatever, but yeah, that's the difference. So in this practice, we learn to intentionally shift and modulate our lens of perception, but not so far that we can't interact with the world. Now, we might be a little bit weird to some people, and that's just the way it goes, but we're still able to interact. We're still able to live. We're still able to have a job. We're still able to have hopes and dreams and aspirations and get things done.
Still able to clean up shit in your apartment.
Yeah, just without all the emotion. 1 second, gotta blow my nose. That's the biggest difference between Ernest 10 or 15 years ago, maybe even Ernest a year ago, I don't know, and Ernest last week. Because I didn't have any, I just looked like this totally stone cold chill person cleaning up shit. Just because it's like, what am I gonna do? You know, why would I allow myself to get in an extreme? Why would I get mad at the dog? Like he didn't do it on purpose. And I didn't even feel the pull to get angry this time. So but I could see the dynamic, and I'm like, this is so much easier when you're not steeped in emotional feedback. So I didn't get mad at the dog. I didn't, why is this happening to me? You know, none of that shit. That's all poor me and a whole bunch of self-pity. And I reject pity. That's a personal principle. You can do whatever you want with these words, but I reject pity. All right, so any questions about shifting or modulating the lens of perception? I kind of brushed over that quickly and combined it with dream walking. It could exist as its own topic, shifting and modulating, because it is an important thing. You can sit down
Well,
and
even the shifting and modulating, when you said I reject pity, I mean, that's an example. You don't mean I reject pity like I have armor, or I rail against pity, or I condemn pity, or because that's not modulating toward what, that's not engaging the space. Rejecting pity is like a Teflon rejecting something sticking to it. It's just, no, pity isn't something I receive I don't receive pity because I don't see the place for it toward me or toward anybody because it's interference. So it's not it doesn't have to be a long thought process. It's something you arrived at because as a result of your practice, that you recognized pity as a form of interference. There's no need to convince anybody of it or to have an argument about it, or it's just a degree of recognition in your practice.
And that's a perfect way to frame it, as interference. It can be felt as interference, and that's how you know. Eventually, you can just feel what is interfering with what. What are we looking for? So,
Balance.
more specifically, you've mentioned it several times today.
Peace.
Peace, or the technique of engaging the space. When you feel that space in your head, right about this area, the front, the sides, this area, and I know that thought uses other aspects of the brain, but you can feel it. You can just feel so much more. I don't know I don't know any other way to describe it really, other than it feels like there's more space right here. But that's the technique. Engage that space. That space is the derivative of peace. You've created that through your practice, and then you can engage it and expand it. Any questions? Dream walking. It is a nice feeling. I would say that counterbalance, things like that. I wouldn't say that I was dream walking when I was cleaning up the poop. I definitely had lost like the capstone of my practice to a certain extent. I can go back to it. And I modulated back to it. You know, notice I use the word modulate because I didn't shift back to it, or I would have been able to stay there better. But yeah, you know, I was interacting with my practice, kind of going back and forth a little bit between the capstone recognition and my hand physically scooping up poop to put it in the garbage. And then eventually we'll get to one of the most important aspects of the practice to a certain extent, which is the act of alignment. We could call the act of alignment, which is the next to last topic of the 20 topics, we could call that elongated flow state. Or you have created space, you're focused on your practice, you're doing your damn thing, you're feeling aliveness, you're feeling your different forms of deliberate modulation, whatever that is. For me, it's I really like the vacation feeling, things like that. Where was I going with that? Oh, yeah. And then so the active alignment is, there's different ways that I could say that, different ways that I could describe the active alignment. The active alignment will be a person who is in a supreme state of adaptability. So they're going to be able to easily adapt to poop on the floor because they're in this active alignment, and it starts to look like elongated flow. And then it looks like, and I'll use myself as an example. My relationship structures with Shayna are just, if we do a comparison, like conscious relationships, what would that look like? People growing and evolving together. So I'll just summarize. My relationships romantically, 100% improved, like just ridiculously better than the turmoil that I used to put myself in. My relationships with friends and family and things like that. I have a weird relationship with my family. I can talk about that another day, but they're weird with me, I guess you could say, because they think I'm weird, but I don't think I am. So the active alignment is ultimately one of I wouldn't put it as a goal, because I don't recommend, thinking about it, or it becomes a derivative that you can shine the light of your attention on, and that's hydrostasy talk. Earlier in the practice, we want to think about it, and we want to imagine it, and we want to affirm it, and all that bullshit. In hydrostasy, you can just shine your attention on it and feel it, bottom line. So it's that quick. But the active alignment is life flow. So my relationships have all improved. My ability to interact with people truthfully has improved. My ability to get shit done and do it in a quality manner has improved. My creativity has improved. My ability to manage my creativity, because I was getting so creative that I just had so many ideas. I was fucking all over the place. I've gotten much better at managing and balancing my own creativity.
Except that was a part of your evolution of improvement. Like everything
Sure.
you just said about where you are right now would have been true just beyond basic alignment, in
Yeah,
counterbalance,
it would have
in
been better.
at any place in this practice that you were or anybody is, you can say all of those things are true
True.
to
Yes,
some degree.
to
To
some
me,
degree.
it's about circling back. You always circle back to basic alignment. Like you just have the totality, the habit, momentum, the accumulation has happened. And so you're as you evolve, as time goes forward, I don't even want to say time, as you practice, you still do all of the same basic things that you learned in the beginning. It's just you're looking at it through a cleaner lens of perception. So I don't want to even say cleaner, through a lens of perception that has more gaps. There's more space to engage.
It will.
And so you circle back all the time, every day. You circle back through basic alignment. You just allow it and engage it with more momentum and accumulation. And so therefore there are expanded and derivatives.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Circle back. It does make sense. Circle back doesn't resonate as much.
It resonates with me. I think of it as like a spiral, like like those little springs on the inside of a pen. I just see that the evolution isn't in a straight line. It's kind of a spiral to me. That's how I feel it, is as a spiral. And so I am still, that's why I get just as much from you starting at square one and doing a beginner class is just as valuable to me
Oh,
as if we were talking about hydrostasy,
yeah.
because there are elements of that I continue to do. It's like you said, you build it as soon as you open your eyes in the morning. So basic alignment just means something differently to me. But you just explained my relationships are so much better. But the
Oh, sure.
better has changed every time you explain it, because it's an expanded level of engagement, degree of engagement.
So here's a way to look at it. So what you're saying, I think, is accurate. You know, there's a improvement all throughout the practice if you do it. That's the caveat. If you do it, if you don't do it, you're not gonna. It's just going to be very up and down, back and forth. Sometimes it's just quasi. That's how
Right, you'll be in counterbalance all the time.
yeah. Um, and then it's also like quasi practice. So you're not even counterbalancing, because counterbalance is a part of the practice. So sometimes it's just forgetting, you know, for the whole day or for whatever. But what I'm talking about now is the capstone, or not the capstone, the when we draw close to the end of the practice, you can't help but notice everything is right where you put it. It is conscious creation, but intelligence is closer to desire. So if it's not conscious creation from the perspective of being ruled by the four destroyers or five destroyers, conscious creation being ruled by the five destroyers, you are consciously creating a life where you don't have to do shit. You're on vacation all the time. You can just sit on the beach and watch. That's all indulging. It's all wanting to exist in an extreme. It's all coming from non-intelligent cognition. It's coming from a place of suffering. Honestly, that's where that's really coming from. So the idea here is that we have bursts of just do energy. It looks like flow state. What I'm pointing out is that this practice can lead to a long-term accumulative type of flow state that we call conscious creation. And I don't like the word attraction. It's a silly word for what we're talking about, but your ability to determine everything in your life experience is far more profound because you're far more aware of everything that's occurring. So at the beginning of the practice, we're like, well, how can I make my life how I want it? You know, how can I make my job the way I want it, and my relationships the way that I want it, and my interaction with myself and how I feel and my emotions? How do I make everything the way I want it? I want it. I want it. I, me. And I get it. So I can completely understand where that's coming from. When we get into this other layer of practice and we're in hydrostasy, we can't help but notice everything is right where I put it, and I can continue to put it right where I want to put it. And that is the very definition of conscious creation. I have just taken responsibility with what I'm offering and the way that I share things, because I only really want to talk about that type of creative ability when intelligence is aligned with desire. That way you're not trying to go out and manifest a fucking Ferrari, because you'll be 110 years old and you'll be like, why the fuck did I buy that car? I could have done so many other things with that, or whatever, you know, or you won't even fucking think about that car because it's not important. So you were spending your money or doing all of these things on things that were ordinary cognition, all ordinary cognition. There's, you know, seeking non-ordinary, but like Donna said, we don't really understand how we're getting there. We don't really understand that it's not the things and the stuff. But again, if we're attaching and clinging, we won't see that dynamic. So the act of alignment is conscious creation without all of the interference from the five destroyers. And I'm using myself, and I don't like doing this often, so I'll only do this in a small group. I have a job that I go to every day that I enjoy. I put myself there. I'm at the job that I want to be at because I want to be there. It's a good atmosphere. There's good people. I enjoy the work. I am dream walking. I'm not bored or at odds with the moment. How do I know? Because I don't want to be anywhere else other than where I'm at. I'm not trying to constantly create emotion and different feel. I don't have to do that. You know, it will occur on its own. And if I want to do it, I can. I reserve that right. So the idea is that this practice, the second to last topic, is all about conscious creation. And that's what dream walking will also help lead to. And then before you know it, you're in the career that best suits you, that best suits your temperament. You're right where you want to be. There's still challenges. Your kite is still in the clouds. So dogs still poop on the ground. You know, we're not exempt from challenges. But life is where we put it. I'm in the city that I want to be in for reasons that I like. I like walking. I like being able to go to the grocery store. I like being able to do all of the things that I want to do walking, so I don't have to drive everywhere, so I can be more environmentally conscious because I care about the environment. Like, I want to do more things personally to help contribute to a better planet. Every one of my desires is lining up. I can't help but notice it. Like, it's all right there for me. It's all adding up. It all makes a lot of sense. I'm going back to school, but I don't feel any pressure. I'll always be learning. I can see that with my capstone. I can see a broader perspective where I will probably always be enrolled in a course because I like learning. How stupid would it be for me to continue to enroll in things just to get done, just to get through it, just to rush through it and feel miserable the whole time? I got that goal, I got that degree, or I got that certificate, and that's all I wanted. Now on to the next thing so that I can feel miserable just to get what I want. No, like, that dynamic is so broken. It doesn't make any sense. It's insane. So the dream walking will lead to some of these other things that I'm talking about, because the act of dream walking is the act of conscious creation. And the more that we get into what I call the act of alignment, that is ultimate adaptability. That means the dog can shit on the floor and you don't have a huge emotional reaction. It means that things aren't necessarily going your way in the world and you don't react to it in the old patterns, in the old ordinary forms of cognition. And this will make more sense when you read the hydrostasy book, because I'll really go into ordinary and non-ordinary, list them all out, comparing, and so you can see what's what. But ultimately, this system will lead to conscious creation. It will lead to the law. I'm putting this in huge air quotes because I do not like the word attraction. But it will lead to more of what you want in life, but your desire will be more aligned with universal intelligence. So if it's not win for everybody, that's not universally intelligent. If it's just thinking about you and you, me, that's not universally intelligent. An organism doesn't thrive because it's just sitting there thinking about itself. That's very inefficient. And that is I used to call it the sixth pillar of the practice, the act of alignment. And the more that when I talk about it on that day, I'll talk about more techniques that help to keep that in focus and to help with the act of alignment. Hint, the capstone. The capstone is the number one thing that helps me with the act of alignment, which is something that we've talked about since day one, and it's always been related to the law of attraction. I just can't talk about it the way that other people do because I'm not interested in taking people's money. So I'm not
So
going to.
what's the capstone?
The capstone is, so it looks like this, Michael, and I'll talk about this more later because it would kind of get away from today's discussion a little bit. But I will show you a picture where my practice is drawn out this way. And this is my order of operations every single day. And this triangle has changed a little bit over time, and it will continue to change probably. But I have my base techniques that I start out with the moment that I wake up. And then this is why I don't really prefer the circle around, as Donna would say it, because I don't circle around, I build on it. I build on basic alignment throughout the day. So I'm still doing basic alignment. And I get it. It's just a different way of talking about it. It's not wrong or right or anything. Donna's just explaining how she feels. Circle back doesn't resonate with me because I never left it. I can't circle back to something that I never went away from. And the way that I've designed the practice, basic alignment begins the second I wake up. Here I am in this life, in this body, in this mind. Where are my techniques? And I will be 110 years old. I will have everything you see in that Igong book, level or layer 1, I will be doing it at 110 years old. I'll have objects of power. I will have places of power. I will have support structures, all of that stuff, because I'm as committed to this practice as I would expect anybody else to be. But to answer your question, Michael, the capstone is this. And my practice always leads to this capstone. And then the capstone has an effect. And I can draw the effect and I can talk about the effect, but you'll have to feel it for yourself. And to some extent, we've had little brushes, but there's aspects to this that can't be brushed because it requires the element of momentum. So if somebody says they brushed it, then we're not talking about the same thing, but it leads to this effect. Do you see what I just drew? That's an effect.
Right.
hard to talk about. I have to draw it. So
Right.
the capstone, to answer your question, are 2 points of attention that I maintain throughout the day, in addition to everything else that I'm doing. And when I say go back to the practice, I'll go back to my 4 directions of attention to lead me back to my capstone. So if anything, the capstone, I'll circle back to maybe the under layer, but it all builds. So, but if I'm doing my capstone, I'm still doing basic alignment. It's just a whole lot more momentum. But this is, do you remember, Michael, how we would say we're all one, man? I'm just the whole universe experiencing itself as a human being.
Right.
Yeah. But we're actually
Sensing into that. Yeah.
we're actually sensing into that. It's a
Yeah.
part of our actuality, but it's oneness. And you can feel it. We can brush this all the time. We can feel this universal oneness that we are a part of everything. Everything is a part of everything. And rather than rejecting one and clinging to the other, we find balance. There is what we call physical, and then there's what we call non-physical. And they can actually tango. They can work together. We don't have to reject them and cling, just like ordinary and non-ordinary. We don't cling to one and reject the other. We find balance between the two, because with balance, there's power. And this practice is built on the principle of balance. It doesn't violate that principle once ever. So the capstone of the practice,
Yep.
one half of it is, does that make sense, Michael? Did you have a question? Universal oneness as a point of attention, not as some concept that we use as pretentious shit to say to women or whatever. It is, we're feeling it, we're experiencing the oneness. Remember when I said that Gene is doing a cheat where he is imagining himself in third person? That will help lead to that feeling of universal oneness, because you can't be clinging and attaching to your stream of thought while simultaneously having this one, or this expanded view of yourself, and you see all of the aspects of the human being. And I start to call that, I put it in air quotes because I don't mean we know every single piece, but we can see the totality of ourselves. The totality is the physical, which is the seen, the non-physical, which is the unseen and the unknown, and then the unknowable. We can actually put all 3 into context, and we have the total human experience, instead of what we're doing in ordinary cognition. And that's like, there's this huge experience, but instead I'm just going to get down here in this little corner and focus on this one little desire that's not going my way. And I'm just going to narrowly focus on that for the rest of the day, for the rest of the week, for the rest of the month, for the rest of the year, for the rest of my life. And then we miss that expanded view. And that is a complete waste of the human experience. We might as well have just been a dog or a bear. Nothing against dogs and bears, but.
Okay. So taking this, and I'm seeing that pyramid diagram and with the capstone, and I started to pause for a moment and sense into that, and I could immediately feel that you put an arrow around capstone. Start to feel the world like come just right back. You're going inward. It's like a reverse corkscrew, right? But sensing into the points of attention and realizing, yeah, my general, I'm going to call it pity party, when I'm like that, I'm not sensing into capstone or sensing into points of attention or holding those points. I'm not in the practice. So I'm still sort of surfing on whatever it is without doing what I know to do. And it's, I've learned it in many forms, right? But in this specific form, it's laid out. And so I'm like, still a leaf at some point, but a lot more grounded also. I think I'm going to give myself credit. I'm not necessarily spinning. And okay, so I want to ask about pity for a second. Could you define pity? And then I've got a question coming after that. But just so we get a basis on that.
Yeah. Here, real quick, I'll finish this picture though, and then I'll define pity, I guess, if you want to talk about that. But the capstone is 2 things. It's split attention. So I have oneness and also the abstract quality of the moment. And that's the capstone of my practice. If I'm maintaining both of these, I am in an elegant fucking flow, and I'm going to feel this picture that I drew. And then that's it. I walk away from this practice. In terms of adding to it, I have nothing. The abstract principles just will help a person maintain this. But at that point, there's nothing else that I can really offer. Where are
Well,
your
there's an element of practicing it.
That's all an element of practice, because what I'm talking about, the feeling, just like engaging the space, you're putting your attention there deliberately. You can't put your attention on something that you haven't created, that doesn't exist. So through the practice, we have created this oneness that we can access easily, or more easily, and then that becomes our point of attention. We stay there as an active point of attention. Active point of attention. So engaging the space, which is peace, that can become our active point of attention that we engage. Does that make sense?
That does.
Yes.
So not this. Yeah. Sorry.
Uh, those things that I'm talking about are hydrostasy, and it is inaccessible if we're still counterbalancing. So
Right.
I would recommend focusing on the counterbalance or the warrior training practice before you can still have brushes with it. That's all good, but that's not what I'm talking about in hydrostasy. So I just want to be careful. It is perfectly possible, but I want to be careful to differentiate what is actually occurring. At this point in the practice, these feelings of oneness are our point of attention. When you had a brush with it, it was in your field of perception and you had your attention on it. When your attention is not on universal oneness, for you, it doesn't exist. It's just a thought that's currently not happening, so it doesn't exist. Does that make sense? The possibility of it exists, but you're not accessing that.
Yeah.
possibility.
Yeah. It seems like it exists. You're just not accessing it. That's what it seems like. You're just still one with everything.
But how does that help you?
You're not realizing it. Yeah.
You're not realizing it. You're not accessing it. It's not active.
I'm with you, and I don't want to shift it to pity. I just want to understand something. I was trying to ask you the
Pity is
definition, but it's basically the victim, right? That you're going
it's
back
victim
into
mentality. It's feeling sorry for somebody, feeling sorry for yourself.
for yourself, for someone else, for positive mindedness, and everything else. Yeah, so I do that all the time, and I recognize when I do that, I make it very serious. I make it, I do it on a daily basis. Call it human suffering for a moment, which is where when you said, "Oh, I look away from that because I recognize it," it's like I want to give it its due for a second. It's not like that for some of us, right? I mean, it's not like that for me. Sometimes psychologically, but meaning within myself, but at other times based on something going on in the outside world, right? And then it goes into othering, or it goes into that outside kind of, and like outside in cognition. So that cognition is real when it's real. And you said I'm looking away from that. I just want to which is just fair. It's just fair. If you're in your practice and you're at your capstone and you're doing your Tai Chi or your yoga, you might say, you know what? That mind construct that I would have attached to is no longer so meaningful to me that I'm going to throw a pity party and delay the rest of what's going on.
Well, pity is leaking power. So I addressed pity a long time ago. That was a part of my redirection of the rule of three. Because pity is a form of getting down on yourself, getting down on other people, and it's a form of interference. We're feeling sorry for somebody because we think that they should be in, and that's just more of our thought. That's just more of our ordinary cognition. So I no longer create the energy of pity because I would redirect it using the rule of three, and not to change emotion, to go back to my practice so that it changes in a more elegant way, because it's always changing. So I don't sit with an emotion. So if I have an emotion, I'm having it. It's occurred. I don't need to change it. It's changing anyway. This is one of the most fundamental ways that this practice interacts with emotion. No matter what the emotion is, if it's occurring, it's occurred. It's occurred. What are you going to do? I mean, it's happened. Trying to change the emotion is a form of trying to control, manipulate, and force. So I'm not going to try to change the emotion. I'm going to go back to the practice. And going back to my practice, maintaining points of attention, redirecting back to the practice. Redirection should always say, redirect back to the practice, redirect back, because you pointed it out. When you start to do this pity bullshit, you're not doing your practice. You're thinking and you're going into all of this suffering, and our practice, we're losing our points of attention. So I don't just not look at it. I go back to my practice, and my practice isn't putting attention on pity for other people or myself, because that doesn't, when you're feeling pity, you can look at the direction of that energy, and it is not leading towards inspiration. So it violates one of the very first principles of repetitive, habitual, and not making us feel well. It doesn't make us feel inspired. We start to feel shitty because we're labeling, judging, comparing, contrasting, trying to figure other people out when we're giving pity parties. Now, that doesn't mean we don't care about people. One of the earliest things that we've seen in the human species is a human, or I guess they would have been pre-human, but they had a broken leg that was mended. So the human species is one of the few species that will care for another human who has been injured. And other, animals, you break a leg, you're screwed. Like the herd is leaving you. Like, you're fucked. Sorry, but you got a broken leg. We got to leave you behind. The human being cares about other human beings, and so will help them mend. That's all fine. That's not thinking pity thoughts about bullshit, because that's leaking power. So caring about somebody, perfectly valid. It's something that the human being seems to care about other human beings. We're not pack animals, but we're definitely social animals. But the pity and the thinking and all of that bullshit is all extra, and it is a form of leaking power. And it just doesn't occur for me anymore. But when it did occur, I would redirect back to my practice, because my emotion is always changing. I just want it to change in an elegant way that leads towards inspiration. So, Michael, when we're talking about emotion, we're never trying to change it. I want to underline that, circle that, because it's already changing on its own. But I'm not going to sit there with it. I'm not going to highlight it. I'm not going to just, oh, there's my pity or my pity feel. I'm just going to sit with that. I'm going to allow it to exist, because now you're focusing on it. Now you're giving it attention, and you're likely going to start thinking shit, and then you're going to start to create more of it. So let's not play games here. Or if a person is feeling pity, they're thinking pity thoughts. You're not doing your practice when you're doing that. It is a form of leaking power, and it will very likely, because you're thinking pity thoughts in the first place, it's going to lead to more thoughts. And so you are changing your emotion, but in a way that's not going to feel better, and it's not going to benefit you. So people, when they say, I just want to sit with you, what are you really talking about? Like, what do you mean? You're honoring the emotion. What the fuck are you talking about, honoring it? Like, what do you're acknowledging it. You notice that it's there. That's all fine. But if you give it your attention, just like a pain in your shoulder, if you just focus on your shoulder the whole time, the pain gets worse. And then very likely you'll start to think thoughts, which leads to more tension, which leads to counterbalance. And now you have pain all over your body. Does that make sense, Michael? At my point in the practice, I have done so much redirection and so much rule of three. I don't feel pity. I still feel I care about people. So I want people to do well, however they define it. But one of the aspects of non-interference is I'm not going to pretend that I know what's best for you, unless you come to me for acupuncture. And then within the frame of acupuncture, I'll do an assessment and then a treatment. But that's different. I'm not doing anything that you haven't asked me to do within the bounds of the profession. So does that make sense, Michael?
Yes, a lot of sense. Yeah, and it's pity outside and inside. And we're using the word, but it goes into that victim consciousness triangle, and then
I don't know anything about pity outside, because pity is an emotion and it's an act that a person does. So it's always inside. I don't know what you mean
no,
by
I'm talking about, I guess there's versions of it about others, about situations,
self-pity
and
versus
then self-pity. Yeah.
And pity for other people will always come from self-pity, just like othering will always come from a focus on self. If you stop focusing on yourself, you'll stop othering. When you stop self-pity, eventually you'll realize that it doesn't benefit you to pity other people as well. Because
Right.
this could be the exact situation that they need to learn. This could be all a part of their cognitive processes. I don't know. It's not my place to say. That's a form of interference and trying to control. And it's not my place to do that.
Right. It's patterns of thinking that are cognized at some point, but it's not necessarily your true nature.
What
And
is
it
true
blocks.
nature?
it blocks the true nature.
What is true nature?
The true nature is like ineffable, and you can't describe it. You put it in that picture, which is like radiant, like the sun. That's our true nature. Like a baby, when they're not crying, they're holding their feet. They're sort of happy. That's our true nature, I think.
At some
And
point,
the parents didn't get a playbook. They say no, 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 no. They figure out a way to stop that, and then that becomes our cognition, and yada yada.
yeah, I think at some point though, these binary distinctions will lose their momentum. They'll lose their solidity with you. So
Right,
true
right.
nature
In the
versus
practice, when you're not so attached to it.
yeah, because if you say true nature, that implies untrue nature. And at that point now we're kind of starting to create differentiations, and I don't want to do that. So
Right,
I-
you're trying to say it's not for advancement in some way. However, it turned out is not right. So then it becomes plus or minusing the situation.
yeah, it's just plussing and minusing isn't necessary.
I got you. I'm with you. Okay.
Yeah, so I don't really get in, and the word nature and natural, typically that's a word that just means lacked human intervention. Because would you say a house is natural? Humans built the house, but is it natural?
Yeah, that's what I was just gonna say. But humans are
Exactly.
natural too. So if
Exactly.
the whole thing is just one, then there's no
A
argument.
bird built the nest, so is the nest natural? So typically when we use the word natural, it requires definition and context. And that typically just means without human intervention. Did it occur without a human intervening? That's the way that we use the word natural. So I don't really get into our true essence, and because now we're creating differentiation, multiplicity, because if there's the true essence, there's the untrue essence, and then there's reality, and then there's I just get out of all that bullshit and go back to my practice.
I can see that. Yep.
All right. So dream walking is a result that can become a point of attention. It can become a point of practice, but it is the result of accumulated momentum of space in the overall amount of cognition. If you're not creating space in the overall amount of cognition, if you're not maintaining a point of attention all day, the hydrostasy practice isn't the place to be right now. And that's okay. We want to maybe go back more towards warrior training, which is the traps of thinking, or maybe back it up even to basic counterbalance, which is still okay. Again, it's like a pyramid that we're building, so there's no leveling up. But there's also no skipping steps. So, yeah. Okay, any questions?
When do we go to Alpha Centauri?
I don't know, man. That's on you.
That's a joke. That's an earnest joke.
Yeah, I know. I don't know what we'll do when we get there.
Meteorites coming from the sky.
And there's so many people who want to get to Alpha Centauri, but like their life is in complete shambles. It's like, don't you want to work on that first? Like, doesn't it make sense to get your shit together before you go traveling interdimensionally to speak to
At supernova speed?
It's just the mind. The mind is easily bored, and then it requires complex forms of entertainment the more bored that it gets. And then it can make up all kinds of interesting things.
Yeah, if you look, just if you don't mind, do you mind? Just one more topic. If you look at, yeah, okay. If you look at Elon Musk, like one mind that got it together in that way is actually going to Alpha Centauri or somewhere. He can name whatever he wants, but he was able to build it with a team, but build the ship that would take him there. It's just interesting if the aspect of what the mind can do if it's not blocked.
And would you want to trade places with Elon Musk psychologically? I know you wouldn't mind his fortune, but have you seen him psychologically? Have you seen his personal life?
No, I mean I've seen some of he doesn't go out. I don't know.
It's interesting. So one of the things I do notice is that sometimes, we look at the creations and we're like, this is what it required. It required so much sacrifice. I would say that was not the most efficient dynamic. Yes, they created something, but look at the principle. They created suffering for themselves and people around them in the process, and that is not the most efficient dynamic. So yeah, Elon Musk, built PayPal, built a big company, is doing all this shit, and I'd be damned if I work for him. I'll be damned if I get
Right.
an
No, I'm
email.
talking about the space travel aspect of it. Like they
Um,
literally built a
And
rocket
that's
ship
cool.
to take him to Alpha Centauri or whatever he wants to name it.
And that's
It's
fine.
just an interesting thing to see about autism and how if the
Oh,
mind is not blocked,
oh, his
then it
mind is
can come up
blocked.
with
Let me assure you.
or whatever.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
this
yeah.
just that we can come up with anything. That's what I'm trying to say.
But what we're looking at is principle. We can see where personal power can be in small areas, but not in the entire life experience. That's not life flow. That is one area. They've accumulated a lot of money. People want this stuff. So they look at him as successful. Fuck that. No. For me, no. So I'm not looking for that to be my measurement of success. And when we look at
Right.
some of these things that we say are successful, well, how did they get there? What kind of condition did it create for their family, for the people around them, for their employees? Was it win for everybody? Chances are probably not. So there are vast amounts of suffering that are probably not being highlighted because it's not as interesting as going to Alpha Centauri on SpaceX.
Right. No, I see that.
The mind is easily bored, and it wants to focus on these types of things because it's what can entertain the mind. That's
It's
how
a
we live in
project, like a super project. It's not
well, it's just
necessarily
creativity. He's just being creative, and that's cool, you know. So there's areas of his cognition that he has allowed for more creativity, but the overall life experience, I don't know. I wouldn't trade anything. I would not trade my mind for anything under the sun, especially Elon Musk's fortune or his personal creativity.
right. It's your own creativity. I'm just talking the aspect of project. It's interesting without some filter of blockage. What can be developed?
Without interference, you equal just do energy, conscious creation.
Yeah.
And that is accessible in this practice. That's what I'm talking about with life flow. It's just you're doing, and you can't help but notice that everything is right where you put it. And it might be similar to something Elon Musk has created. Then again, it might be something completely different.
Yeah. I'm gonna go back to counterbalancing. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah. I don't know if there's a song I want to be like Elon, but I definitely don't. I don't even want to be like Mike. That's a perfect example. Michael Jordan, right? We look at the pinnacle of success in basketball, but then you watch The Last Dance. How much suffering did he create for himself and others? And how much suffering is he existing in now, despite the fortune, despite the success, despite the personal power? And I'm not judging. I don't want to go into opinions and everything else, but I'm just looking at one principle. And the principle is that personal power is a product of intention and will. Even Michael Jordan, even Elon Musk, even Donald Trump, even these people, you know, on the internet who are social influencers or whatever the fuck they're doing, intention and will builds personal power. This practice will make your life intention and will and personal power, not just individual areas of it. Does that make sense? And it will look how you create it. It won't look how anyone expects it to look. All right, well, go back to counterbalance and let me know how that works out. Otherwise, I will see you guys again on Thursday for group study. I'm still working on the second book, which is Counterbalance. So I have the first book of Igong. I'm working on the second book of Igong, and then I'll attach that all to a website and make it all accessible to the world. That's the plan. And then the world can do whatever they want with it. I don't care. All right, well, I will see you guys again soon. Happy Tuesday, and I'll see you on Thursday, if you can make it. And I'll let me save this whiteboard real quick before I forget. Just in case anybody wants to see this. The abstract quality of the moment, Mike. Where does that go? Where does that, if we can brush it, if we can brush quality, if we can brush oneness, where does it go? Why does it go? Does it need to go? Interesting questions. Okay, I will see you guys again on Thursday. Thanks for hanging out. Bye, Lauren. Bye, Jerry. Bye, Mike.